Hello, ladies and gentlemen, in World Civilizations 1. Let's hope my recording has actually started and I'm not just talking to blank air at this point. But either way, welcome back to this upcoming week. As you may have noticed, to this week we're going to transition into some more quote-unquote modern and powerful empires. First, by looking at the Axial Age Societies, and second, by looking at, of course, at the famous Alexander the Great. As always, I want to start off looking at some of the key terms you're going to want to focus on this week. This week, we're going to have to cover this, for this lesson in particular, we're going to have to go through quite a bit very quickly, because there are a lot of civilizations I'm supposed to cover. So, a couple of important philosophies and groups we're going to look at are Confucianism, the Brahmins, Buddhism, the Greek polis, and we'll also look at North American and African societies during this axial age. As well, also, of course, I want to make sure you're aware of some important upcoming dates. You have a content quiz coming up on October the 16th. It'll be due at 5 p.m. Our initial office hours meeting as well needs to be concluded by October the 16th, this Friday at 5 p.m. Finally, our first debate is coming up on October the 23rd at 5 p.m. By tomorrow, I plan to go ahead and send out team sign-up lists and everything and potential times to sign up for. And there will also be an alternate assignment available in the debate prompt. So if you're not able to make the live debate, don't worry, I'm not going to fail you. You'll just have an alternate assignment to do instead. So that went over that fairly quickly, but if you have any questions about any of these assignments, please let me know as soon as possible. As some of you have already noticed, I'm very willing to be flexible if you let me know about problems beforehand. However, if you let me know about a problem 5 minutes before the due date or after the due date, there's not really much I can do at that point. At that point, you're on your own. Keep me aware of problems as soon as they arise. Don't wait till the last minute, and definitely don't try to manufacture something. That's usually pretty obvious as well. But in the meantime, let's jump right into the thick of things. One thing I want you to keep in mind, particularly for this lesson, and really just for the rest of class, because it's going to be a big theme we're going to continue discussing. What role do you think that religion should play in politics and society? As you may have noticed if you've done the reading, of course, religion plays a big role in a lot of these civilizations we're getting ready to look at. Do they play positive roles? And again, what kind of roles should religion play in politics? Keep that in mind. In the meantime, let's go ahead and jump into what an axial age and a second generation society actually is. The Axial Age is considered to be a transitional period in world history between about 1000 and 350 BCE, when the old first empires we've discussed in class already started to give way to great empires such as Alexander the Great, Chandragupta, and the Hans. Keep in mind throughout the rest of these couple of weeks how these empires are different from what we've discussed before. Second-generation societies in particular are some of these empires which are built on their predecessors, but departed in several important areas. So keep in mind essentially how these different groups are using the past and using past ideals and techniques to improve themselves, but how they're also separating themselves and coming up with new ideas. That's going to be, again, a big theme we're going to look at throughout really the rest of the semester. Now, to jump straight into the thick of things. And again, I want to stress that if you want to have any questions about anything in this class, please let me know. As you may have noticed, I am having to go through stuff very quickly because there's so much we have to cover in just 12 weeks. So please let me know if anything leaves you behind. But in the meantime, one of the things that started to set China apart during this time was the formation of the 100 Schools of Thought. The 100 Schools of Thought was formed by philosophers who were defeated, political elites who were defeated by the Zhao China dynasty we talked a little bit about recently. Now, one thing I want to focus on really briefly is just why you think it would be the defeated elites that are going to be the ones that come up with this stuff. And here's our first awkward pause of the day. But yes, very good imaginary class. The defeated elites are the ones that are essentially coming up with this because this is how defeated politicians attempt to make themselves useful. And when you're defeated, you have to come up with some sort of service you can still provide. So many of these defeated political elites would get themselves to stay around as advisors to the new regime by coming up with these different philosophies. For example, Confucianism was started by, of course, the infamous Confucius, who lived from about 551 to 479 BCE, who was originally just a minor politician in Zhao China. His philosophy was based on a few key ideas. First, he believed in that humans' natural tendencies would produce harmony. He essentially believed that all people were inherently good. Do you agree with that statement? I tend to be a little bit skeptical, but I'd love to hear other perspectives as well. He was a big believer in the patriarchal family model, and not only believed in it being applied to families, but that it should be applied to society as a whole. Essentially, he believed that a Chinese king should treat heaven like his father and treat the subjects like his children. Most importantly, he believed that if the king did this appropriately, people within China should naturally submit to the king's authority. He also popularized a great respect for scholars and education, and argued for more equal access to education that was based on people's qualifications, not just their place of birth, or their place in the social hierarchy. His teachings were eventually preserved in the Analects, which we'll talk a little bit more about, which promoted humaneness, rich performance of ritual, loyalty to family, and moral character. Now, to summarize the importance of this, what do you think is the purpose of this philosophy? How is it going to be used by the Zhao in particular? I never know where to look at during these awkward pauses. I can't stare at the camera, that's creepy. But yes, as you guys might have guessed, this is essentially an attempt to ensure and inspire loyalty in the government. If people buy into this idea that a patriarchal family model is the best model for all of society, it encourages loyalty to the king. So you're going to have a bunch of people who are going to treat you like their father, and therefore believe that they need to follow all of your decisions as long as you uphold that loyalty to heaven. It's also going to be further influenced by the idea that all people are naturally good. If humans are inherently good and their attitudes are going to produce harmony, that can inspire more of loyalty in the government, because you believe that your government is inherently good and doesn't really have any natural flaws. So again, keep this in mind. This is all essentially an attempt to ensure continued loyalty in the government. Taoism was quite similar. Taoism has been associated with a potential mythical contemporary of Confucius, who is known as Master Lao. His teachings were preserved in the Tao Te Ching, which translates to the Book of the Way and its power. Essentially, Taoism is the basically I'm not going to get involved philosophy. It stressed following the natural order of things. The chief virtue of this philosophy was Wu Wei, which literally translates to doing nothing. Essentially, Taoists believed that they should accept the state of things instead of trying to get change through politics or government. So don't get involved in trying to change your politics or your government, just accept everything as a natural part of life. Enlightened individuals were ones who should live in acceptance and harmony with nature and view everything that they experience as a necessary change of existence. So again, don't try to fight against your existence. Don't try to really fight for change. Just accept that everything is happening the way it is supposed to be. Now, this one might seem obvious, but just to clarify, why would this be particularly useful for a government to have? Alright, again, thank you, imaginary class. Like I said, this one's probably fairly obvious. If you can convince people to buy into Taoism, they're not going to get involved in trying to change your politics or to change your government. So essentially, a government can do about whatever it wants, and a committed Taoist is just going to say, it's a part of my existence, I see no need to get involved. So, the 100 Schools of Thought was important in China for promoting an alliance between politicians and academics, as I just demonstrated a little bit. The ruler would sponsor the academic and help get them all the research and the funds they needed to carry out their lifestyle, while the academic would provide their expertise in support of the state. So, essentially, as I just mentioned, so I won't spend too much time on this, both of these philosophies, in one way or another, helped encourage loyalty to the government. So the academic got protection and funding for their lifestyle and their research that they needed, and the government got academics who could promote widespread acceptance and support of whatever the government was doing. So yeah, this is one of the first instances we see of academics and religious figures really starting to form a strong alliance with each other. Now, that's in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and switch over to what India was going through at the exact same time. If you remember, we talked about how the Vedic people had a class of priests called the Brahmins. These priests particularly disliked mixing between the lower and upper classes. For example, the Vedic developed their own alphabet by 600 BCE, which is something the Brahmins were not a very huge fan of. Why do you think that might be the case? And to give you maybe a more relevant example you're all familiar with, why were some of the Catholic Church members upset, particularly the priests, when the Protestant Reformation happened and more people could read the Bible for themselves? Awkward pause once again. But yes, very good. It's again about preserving your authority. If the Brahmins are the only ones who can read and share religious texts, it gives them a lot of authority because everyone has to depend upon them to know what the will of the gods is. Spreading out this alphabet lets other people interpret Vedic religious texts for themselves. In response, the Brahmins doubled down on the idea that the king they supported had a divine right to rule. They popularized the idea that there was once a golden age where man was in harmony and didn't need any kings. However, when this period ended, the gods chose a man named Manu to be the king and their representative to humanity. After that, the bronze priests then argued that their religious ceremonies were essential in allowing the king to perform his duties and giving him the blessing of the gods. So, how is this going to help the Brahmin spheres during the time period? How are these actions going to help? I never know what to look at or what to do during these pauses either. Hope they're as awkward for you as they are for me. It's probably not very nice. But yes, as some of you might have guessed, this is again essentially just about preserving their authority and preserving their legitimacy. If they can get the Vedic people to buy into the idea that they are responsible for allowing the king to bring them the message and the power of the gods, people aren't going to really be willing to speak out against them. This helped give the Brahmins quite a bit of authority. However, there was a strong religious response to the Brahmins during this time, and a few various organizations spoke out against them. Now, why do you think parts of the Brahmin philosophy might inspire disagreement, for example? Alright, for those of you who are paying attention, you might have picked up on something I did have to skip over a little bit for now. The Brahmins were particularly passionately against classes intermixing. They didn't want people to elevate their status and possibly compete with the Brahmins for authority. So naturally, a lot of people aren't going to really like the idea that the Brahmins and the kings are giving themselves so much authority at the expense of someone else. This led to other competing religious traditions in the Indian area. For example, Jainism was introduced by Vadhama Mahavira sometime between 540 and 468 BCE. He left his oligarch republic and his prestigious status to become an ascetic, which is someone who avoids possessions and physical pleasures. He popularized a few important teachings that were a big backlash against Brahmin teachings. For one, he argued that the universe's natural laws could not be affected by any god. Sort of similarly to Taoism, this group believed that you couldn't really affect the natural laws of the universe and just had to accept them. He popularized that asceticism is the best path to enlightenment, and finally popularized the idea of ahisma, no hurt, which meant that every living thing had a soul, and killing anything could negatively affect your rebirth. Now, what about this is a big rebellion against the traditions the Brahmins were teaching? What's the most important thing you can see here? Right. As you might have guessed, very good imaginary class who's hopefully watching this at home. And the main thing you want to focus on is the idea that the universe's natural laws cannot be affected by any god. Remember, the Brahmins teach that they are the only ones who are able to bring harmony and bring the god's message to the world. So they're the ones helping to protect the universe. The Jainists, on the other hand, argue that you can't affect the universe at all. The gods can actually really accomplish anything. So that would suggest there's really no point in following any specific god or following the Brahmins. A similar tradition that came around during this time period is, of course, Buddhism. Buddhism was started, if I can get my head out of the way, by Siddhartha Gautama sometime between 563 and 483 BCE. He, of course, is now also known as the Buddha or the Enlightened One. According to the original stories, he left his oligarchic community, much like the Janus founder, at the age of 29 to wander the world for enlightenment. His main goal was to end human suffering. Now, this is obviously a very broad goal, and one thing I'd like you to think about is how exactly you would accomplish it. How exactly do you think the Buddha is going to go about trying to end all suffering? Eventually, according to Buddhists, the Buddha eventually spent 49 days meditating, and at the conclusion of this meditation, which you can see depicted here, he discovered the path to nirvana. This path is eventually known as the middle path, which is essentially supposed to be a balance between self-indulgence and self-denial. The idea is that, like Janus, the Buddha believed that all suffering was ultimately caused by attachments and desires. However, as the Buddha tried to attempt becoming an ascetic, he realized that starving yourself also led to obvious suffering. So the idea is that you have a balance. You indulge yourself enough to where you can survive and not suffer due to neglect, but you deny yourself enough so that you're not constantly grabbing onto more and reaching out for more possessions, which can lead to its own suffering and its own greed. See, essentially it's a middle path between killing yourself and being hugely greedy. Major part of Buddhism were the Four Noble Truths. These are the teachings formalized by the Buddhist Sangha, or the gathering, in the Dhammapada texts. First, again, life is full of suffering. Suffering is caused by desire. The only way to end suffering is to end desire, and the only way to end desire is to follow the Eightfold Path, which leads to the middle path. This involves wisdom, ethics, and mental discipline. Now, I know this, of course, is a very vague and very quick summary of Buddhism. If you have any other questions about it, please feel free to reach out to me. I did write my thesis on this, on some Buddhist history, actually, so while I'm not the biggest expert in the world by any means, I would love the opportunity to clear some of this up. But in the interest of time, since this is a very quick survey course, I can't go into much more detail. But again, this is seen as a big challenge against Brahmin beliefs because, again, instead of relying on these Brahmin priests and the king in order to have salvation and to get access to everything you need to survive, the Buddhist tradition mainly focused on achieving it yourself, beating your own suffering and beating your own desire. So again, essentially people are trying to find ways to achieve enlightenment and happiness without relying on these elitist Brahmin priests. Now, for an abrupt shift, we're going to go ahead and look at city-state politics and what's going on in Greece around the same time. Greek city-states, or Greek society, as you may know at this point, was organized into city-states. These city-states had a variety of government systems. Some had tyranny, some had oligarchies, and some had democracies. The typical family unit was pretty standard for what we've seen in much of the ancient world. Only the land-owning males were allowed for the most part to get involved in politics. Women, for the most part, stayed in the household and had their own private lives. Foreigners and slaves had, of course, much less rights, were not allowed to vote, own property, or fight for the polis. So that's just a very, very quick summary of what Greek city-state life was like. In the meantime, I do want to spend a bit of time talking about the competition among the Greek city-states, because that helps lead to some of the things we're going to talk about next time about Alexander the Great. For example, those of you who are involved in track and field and other sports, for example, might be interested in the Olympic Games, which were organized for the first time in 776 BCE. As you probably know, these were held every 4 years and were considered a sacred truce. It was originally considered to be more of a religious ceremony than an athletic one, and was actually held in honor of Zeus, where the main event was actually the sacrifice of 100 bulls on the third day of the games. That was considered to be the major focus over the games, actually. There were various events that most of us are probably familiar with. There were runners, discus throwers, javelin throwers, long jumpers, wrestlers, and horse and chariot racing. However, one thing I do want to focus on is that while women were for the most part barred from the Olympics, there was actually a female athletic competition that doesn't get much discussion from historians, unfortunately. There was an event called the Hereia, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, where the Greek women were able to have a sports festival in honor of Hera, Zeus's wife. Now, most relevant to what we're discussing today is the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War occurred between 431 and 404 BCE, and was a war between Athens and their Delian League and the Spartans and their Peloponnesian League. This war helped popularize the use of the famous phalanx battle configuration, which you can see a bit of here. For those of you who are familiar with ancient battle tactics, what was so effective about the phalanx? Well, I give you an awkward pause. Alright, those of you who are familiar with a bit of the 300 movie before they totally butcher it, or just a bit familiar with Greek history, know the advantage of the phalanx is that it essentially created a very highly organized military unit that essentially defended each other from attack. You would have these Greek soldiers get them bunched up very close together, and they would have their shields covering each other's weak points. So essentially, it's basically a very slow-moving large tank. You have the spearmen who could attack, and they would defend themselves from attack with their shields. So, reason I want to focus on that is you can see the screenshot up here from the 300 movie. At the very beginning of the first battle in the movie, they actually have a pretty good depiction of the phalanx that shows its strength. Essentially, you have the soldiers banding together and holding off the Persian attack with the combined strength of their combined shields. However, of course, to look good for a Hollywood movie, they immediately break apart after holding out the first attack and run around in a slow-mo montage just slicing people's heads off and going absolutely nuts. While it does look cool, this is actually very historically inaccurate. Organized Greek armies would never break this phalanx formation because if you did, you lost the advantage of having this combined military unit defending and attacking simultaneously. If you break up and just start randomly running into battle, you can be picked off one at a time and don't have the advantage of those shields. So again, anytime you see that occurring in an ancient movie, particularly a Greek movie, that is not very historically accurate. If the 300 had done that initially, they would have died on day one. By the end of the war, the Athenian fleet had been destroyed during the Battle of Aigos-Ptomi, which I'm probably pronouncing incorrectly, and surrendered a year later. Despite the huge casualties of this war, it is considered to be the golden age of ancient Greece, because it is when both Athens and Sparta were considered to be at the height of their military power. Now, I also want to spend a bit of time looking at what art and philosophy was going on in Greece as well. Greece didn't have as many great religious leaders like some of the Indian and other areas had, but they were known for their philosophers. For example, some of their scientists came up with a few important discoveries. A scientist named Thales theorized, that all creation ultimately came from water. Xenophanes, which I cannot pronounce that for the life of me, argued that there was only one creator being or force, and that all other ethnic groups had just come up with other gods in their own likeness. Democritus argued that all matter was made up of invisible particles called atoma, or uncuttables, which of course would eventually result in the discovery of the atom. However, these philosophers are a bit more relevant to what we're discussing today. For example, Socrates stressed the importance of honor and integrity over wealth and power. Plato argued that Greece needed great philosopher kings to prevent the decay of society, which he described in his famous publication, The Republic. Aristotle argued that people needed to gather as much evidence as possible before making any deductions about a subject or a problem. It was essentially sort of an absolutist investigative approach. Now, these, of course, as you might guess, formed a similar function to the Taoists and the Confucianists of China and Indian society. They're essentially trying to promote good Greek values that can promote good welfare for the community, as well as obedience, again, to your whatever king or leaders you have in your various city-states. Yeah. Again, I do want to apologize for rushing through this, but I don't want to hold you here too long. So if you have any further questions about this, please run them by me as soon as possible. Now, one of the last things I want to look at today is to go over some of the indigenous groups that existed in America at this time. For example, you have the Chavin and the Andes, which existed from about 1400 to 400 BCE, which were a group of fragmented societies that were still united by a common religious belief. So instead of having a united group like you have with the, for example, the Chinese with the Zhou dynasty, you have a group of, kind of like the Greeks, independent societies and city-states that are just united by having a common culture and by having common religion. For example, the center of Shavan life was considered to be the Shavan du Huantar, which was a temple and the spiritual capital of the entire civilization. Here they would practice the use of hallucinogenic drugs to receive visions from the gods, worship wild animal spirits, and partake in a lot of feasting. This society existed in a good tropical and subtropical valley, which gave them a good source of produce. However, their llamas were their only available beast of burden throughout their existence. Why might that be a problem? I'll just take a sip of water during this awkward pause. But yeah, for those of you who know anything about llamas, llamas aren't exactly the best pack animals and definitely not the best for transportation. This is arguably one of the reasons the Chauvin never got as organized as other civilizations. It was not as easy for them to travel and commute and trade amongst each other as it was for civilizations that had access to stronger pack animals. Around the same time, you also have the Olmecs in Mesoamerica from about 1500 to 500 BCE, which is again a loose organization of villages that just share a common language and gods, but no clear political unity. These villages, however, were quite large and could contain hundreds or thousands of households. They also produced a wide variety of produce and were famous for producing jade and obsidian products. I also want to take a moment to look at Olmec cities as well in the Olmec civilization. Their main cities were in San Lorenzo, La Venta, and Tres Zapotes. Few common characteristics these civilizations had. They had similar architecture, such as earthen mounds and stone monuments. For example, have any of you been to maybe a local Cherokee or other Native American mound? I don't know if you guys have them too much out there, but there's quite a few in my neck of the woods, actually. Sorry I just said neck of the woods. That's the most country thing I've said in these lectures, probably. But yes, this is very similar to a lot of the architecture we see from other Native Americans in North America. They also produced these stone monuments that were typically jaguar related and great plazas. They produced devotional art and tools for supernatural beings and their shamans. And the belief I thought was interesting is that they believed that many of their shamans were actually were-jaguar shamans, who, during using some of those hallucinogenic drugs and doing those rituals, could turn themselves into jaguars. There was a mix of sport and religion in this society, where ball games would be devoted to the rain god and harvest, and they would potentially be ended by human sacrifices. Does that sound familiar to any of you? Yeah, for those of you who are a little bit aware of ancient South American history, this is very similar to what many historians believe the Mayans did. The Olmec sports are considered to be a bit of an inspiration for later Mayan customs. However, the Olmecs did eventually have a very mysterious decline, very similarly to the Mayans as well. Besides some of the monuments being found at La Venta defaced, there's really no evidence that there was a major war or great upheaval that would cause the decline of the civilization. So many historians still frankly just don't know exactly what happened. Now, one thing I want to focus on for a second is why we aren't typically familiar in most history classes with these cities. We spent a lot of time studying especially the Greeks, despite their very similar decentralized system, just like the Olmecs and the Chauvin, and we're also typically very familiar with what was going on in India, and even more so China. Why do you think in a lot of history classes we don't focus as much on what these Americans were going through, or pre-Americans, really? Think a little bit to how we typically teach Native American history in most high schools and public schools, for example. Alright, for those of you, again, to break the pause, for those of you who are familiar with Manifest Destiny, might be able to answer this. As many of you are probably aware, a big argument for later westward expansion and for a lot of imperialism even in South America, the argument was that the Americans and Europeans were bringing in civilization and essentially enlightenment to these American areas that had lacked really sophisticated civilizations before. Acknowledging these cities and these great accomplishments of the Chauvin and the Olmecs helps contradict that. It's very hard to argue that you're bringing in the light of civilization for the first time when there's civilizations that were already there. So essentially, many historians have tried to bring back the teaching these various civilizations to prove that manifest destiny was unjustified, and you cannot use the argument of bringing civilization to justify what happened to various groups of Native Americans. So that's one reason, even though I had to do it briefly, I wanted to focus on what these civilizations went through. Now, just to very quickly wrap things up, we are going to look just very briefly at what African civilizations were going through as well. One thing I do want to focus on is why Africa, for the most part, did not develop very sophisticated, or not necessarily sophisticated, but very large and centralized civilizations like the ones in China and portions of Europe and Mesopotamia. There were a couple of key reasons why this wasn't really possible. One of the main reasons was the frequent drought and the spread of the Sahara Desert. As you can see here, it covered almost all of the northern African region. This may seem obvious, but why is that going to be a problem? Yes, very good imaginary audience. It essentially assures that almost everything covered in this area is not going to have any cultivatable land. So you can't grow food, so therefore, of course, you can't really produce enough food to support an entire civilization. Because of this is why the Nile Valley area and Egypt was so important for African civilization. It is estimated that throughout the first millennium of BCE, that half or more of the entire African population, that means the entire continent, by the way, not just one country in Africa, all lived in the Nile Valley area. So when you had the Nile River, you could, of course, have irrigation to get your food. But before that, or outside of the Nile River, you basically had no access to any water or cultivatable land. The tsetse fly, which I'm probably not pronouncing correctly, limited this as well because it had a bite that was fatal to most livestock. This may seem obvious as well, but why is that such a problem? Alright, yes, very good. Imaginary class once again. But without those livestock, it of course limits your ability to trade, even your access to meat products, for example, and your ability to travel over land. So again, especially outside the Nile River Valley, you basically had no access to the livestock that could be helpful in farming, food, and any sort of trade. Also, because of this, you had a big labor shortage and land abundance outside of the urban centers. Outside of these cities, there was quite a bit of land, but not enough labor to work it. So therefore, you didn't really have enough people outside the Nile River Valley to set up anything significant. However, there are a few civilizations outside the Nile River that are worth talking about. For example, Nubia existed between about 1700 and 1500 BCE. This group had a central location in East Africa, which is essentially significant, you could argue, because they were essentially between Egypt and the rest of Africa, whatever was out there. This helped set them up as a major trade kingdom. They would give ivory, gold, and slaves to Egypt, but were forced to continually move this kingdom south to avoid Egypt. So this again demonstrates that while they were a significant civilization, due to the various problems in Africa, they couldn't quite reach the might of Egypt. Also, by the time of the Meroitic kingdom, between 400 BCE and 300 BCE, this kingdom had adopted Egyptian hieroglyphics, religion, and architecture, but kept their own language and independence. So again, as you can see here, you have Egyptian-style looking pyramids. So again, this demonstrates a bit the significance of migration, but also demonstrates the significance of the Nubian kingdom. They were influenced, of course, by their proximity to Egypt, but they were still able to keep their independence. Also, you have the Nanak culture from 600 to 500 BCE, which were able to smelt iron, were the first group to smelt iron in Africa, as far as we know, and produce very impressive terracotta figures, which you can see here. Now, again, I know that was a lot to go through, but that's all I have for you today. Please do remember, again, you have these upcoming assignments. If you have any questions about them, please let me know. In the meantime, have a great rest of your week, and let me know if you have any major questions. Thank you.